Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer. Today we are going to be doing a really fun and exciting Easter project. Now, if you're like us, a lot of times around Easter, you really enjoy dyeing Easter eggs. It's a lot of fun to just get those bright, really beautiful colored Easter eggs. But what we kind of decided a couple years ago was that we wanted to stop using those really neon bright, those kind of artificial dyes that you find everywhere this time of year, at the grocery store, your local Walmart, any place like that. It's really easy and really inexpensive to find those egg dyeing kits. But what we found is when we dyed our eggs with that, we weren't really sure if that was something that we should be eating. Now you can always see there's always a little bit of that dye that gets through the shell and gets into the egg. So what I decided to do was to start finding natural ways to dye my eggs so that we wouldn't be wasting eggs, so that we could dye the eggs and then we could also enjoy eating them. And what I discovered when I started doing that was that these eggs are actually even more beautiful than the artificial dyes. And they're all natural ingredients, so we don't have to feel bad at all about eating them. So I have here a dozen eggs that I've selected for my chickens. I just chose only the brown eggs. We don't have any chickens that lay white eggs. You could certainly use white eggs from the store if you wanted to. That will give you kind of a different type of color than the brown eggs will. I do find that the brown eggs, when you dye those, have an even richer color than the white eggs. The white eggs will be a little bit brighter and more pastel. So honestly, what I used to do before I had chickens was to get a dozen white eggs and a dozen brown eggs and dye both, because that gives you a really nice variety. Since we have chickens, we have plenty of eggs, and I didn't really feel right about going to the store and buying white eggs when we already have as many eggs as we need here. So we're just going to be dyeing the brown ones. You can see in here that I have a variety of shades of brown, so we're going to get a variety of results with this. Now, I do have 2 eggs that I slightly cracked when I was pulling them out of the water. Those will still be completely fine. They'll just have to be eaten pretty quickly. So I did go ahead and hard boil this dozen eggs already. So what we're going to do now is we're going to prepare the dyes, and then I'm going to show you exactly how I dye these eggs. So today we're going to be using a variety of different food items to dye our eggs. The first thing that we're going to be using is some red cabbage. Now, because we're using brown eggs, this will give us kind of a deep bluish brown type of color. This actually has a surprising amount of dye in it. If you are using white eggs, it will give you a really pretty true blue. So either way, I definitely recommend using some red cabbage. So we're actually going to do a little bit of an experiment with this cabbage today. A lot of times, even if you're using those store-bought dye kits, or if you're using natural food dye like this, what you'll find is that the instructions will tell you to add a little bit of vinegar to your dye. The reason for that is because it slightly softens the eggshell and allows it to absorb the dye a little bit better and give you a little bit of a richer color. The trouble with adding vinegar to dye made from red cabbage is that it almost acts as a litmus paper, and when you get this deep purpley blue dye from this cabbage, when you add some vinegar to it, it turns it a bright purplish pink. It's a really pretty color, but it's not really the color that we're going for. So we are going to experiment, and we are going to make 2 batches of dye with this cabbage. We're going to use one with vinegar and one without, and we're going to see how that affects the final color of the eggs. The next item that we're going to be using is beets. Now, anyone who has ever chopped or eaten fresh beets knows that beets are an obvious source of dye. They have such a rich color, and they'll really stain everything they touch, which incidentally, it's pretty important if you're doing this kind of project, especially if you're doing this with young kids, to wear old clothes that you do not mind getting stained. I am wearing my old jeans today that I accidentally got cheese wax on about a year ago. So now these have become my gardening / messy cooking jeans. So if I stain those, it's not the end of the world. So these beets will give us a nice rich color. If you're using this on white eggs, they dye a really bright pink. It's really pretty. Since we're using brown eggs, it'll be more like a darker brick red, which will still be really lovely. So we will definitely be using those. The next item that we'll be using is turmeric powder. Now again, turmeric. If you have cooked with turmeric, you know that it really turns things yellow. It's a very vibrant color. I have stained many wooden spoons cooking with turmeric before. So it's a natural choice to dye your eggs yellow. The last food item that we'll be using today is frozen blueberries. Now these, again, are blue, but they have kind of a purplish, almost grayish tint to them. It's really pretty. So we're going to be using those as an alternative to the cabbage dye, just to kind of compare how the two colors compare. Now, if you're using white eggs, I do also recommend using peels from yellow onions. These have a surprising amount of dye in them. The first time I tried these, I didn't really expect them to be very saturated or really give me any rich color. They really did. These will dye your eggs a beautiful orange. I find that the result isn't quite as vibrant when you're using brown eggs, and I don't have a lot of orange onion peels saved up right now. So I'll be skipping that for today. So I have these 4 items. Now, one color that I've never really been able to find a satisfactory dye for is green. Now, I've tried a variety of things. I can't even remember everything that I've tried. I've tried spinach. I've tried certain types of tea. Nothing really seems to give that real green. So what I ultimately ended up doing to get green was to just, go back to kindergarten where you learn about your primary colors. So I would first set my eggs in turmeric, and then I would wipe them off just to get any turmeric residue off. And then I would switch them to the dye with the red cabbage. And doing that makes a really nice green. You can kind of combine colors in other ways too. I found that by first using the turmeric and then using the beets, you get a really pretty coral color. If you let them sit in the turmeric for a shorter amount of time and then switch them to the cabbage water for a long time, you get a really pretty turquoise color. There are so many ways you can kind of play around with combining these colors. Of course, beets and cabbage will make a lovely purple color. There are so many options. So we are just going to get started making our dye, and then we're going to have fun making beautiful eggs. Now with these blueberries, I'm also doing a little bit of an experiment with these because I really do want to save these blueberries and use them in another recipe. So because these are frozen blueberries, basically what I'm going to do is I have 3 cups of frozen blueberries I've added to this pan here. I'm going to add about 2 cups of hot water, just hot from the tap. I'm not going to heat it up or anything. And I'm just going to let those sit. I'm not going to cook them, just let them sit while I prepare the rest of my dye ingredients. And then I'm hoping that the water that they've sat in will be richly colored enough that I can use that as dye. And then I'm going to reserve these blueberries to make a really delicious dessert that we're going to have tonight. And incidentally, stay tuned if you're interested in seeing that, because that will most likely be my next video or possibly the video after that. So let's get a couple cups of water and let those sit on our blueberries. So we're going to let our blueberries soak, and we're going to get started prepping the rest of our dyes. So next I'm going to prepare my cabbage. As I said, I'm going to make a little bit more dye from this cabbage than from the other ingredients because I want to experiment with using vinegar versus not using vinegar. So I'm just going to chop up all of this cabbage that's left. We already used some of the outer leaves for a different project. I'm going to add them into this pan with some water, and we are just going to simmer those for a while until the water looks really saturated in color. Now, I'm really not worried about preserving any of these other vegetables for actually eating, aside from the blueberries, as I mentioned. My family doesn't really eat a lot of purple cabbage or a lot of beets. So honestly, probably what will happen with these leftover vegetables is that they will go to the chickens. So we're just going to give these a rough chop and add them into our pan here. All right, I'm going to add a few cups of water. And I'm going to get this simmering right away, and we'll just keep chopping and add to it. But by starting it right away, we'll get a little bit of a head start. Now, in addition to strong colors, a lot of these foods that we're going to be working with today also have very strong aromas. So be prepared for your house to smell a little pungent, because we'll have turmeric, cabbage, beets. The blueberries don't really smell very much, but everything else has a pretty intense smell. So definitely that's something to be prepared for. All right, so we've got all our cabbage in here along with, I estimated about 5 cups of water. So I'm just going to go ahead and heat that up and let it simmer a little bit. Now you can see my cutting board, I'm using plastic on purpose so it's easier to wash. You can see it does have a little bit of a faint stain of cabbage purple already. All right, so next we're going to tackle beets. I'm just going to give all these beets a rough chop. I'm going to get them in this pan here with a little bit of water. And we're going to simmer them until they have released all their color and juices. Now, you can see that intense beet color there. These are made for dyeing things. So if nothing else, I'm already off to a great start dyeing my hands. To our last pan here, we're just going to measure out a couple tablespoons of turmeric, and then we are going to add to that a few cups of water. And then I'm not sure if cooking this is really necessary or not, but I think it does help bring up the color of the turmeric a little bit. So I am going to add some water to that turmeric pan, and we're going to heat it up just a little bit to really dye that water. So all of our dyes are sitting now. We're letting that water really absorb that color and turn into a nice strong dye. So I'm just going to keep all of these going over probably about a medium-low heat, with the exception of the blueberries, which are sitting on the counter with no heat at all. I'm just going to let those go for a little while. I'll probably check on them in about 15 minutes or so and see if the color seems intense enough. I'll meet you back here when we're ready to move on to actually dyeing our eggs. While we're waiting for our dyes to finish infusing, I chopped up all the beet greens, and we're going to go see if the chickens want a little snack. So I just came out to check on the dyes. Now, I got a little bit distracted and let these go for about half an hour instead of 15 minutes, but I think that was probably a good amount of time. I'm just going to show you what they look like. So here's our cabbage dye. You can see, if you kind of look at how the water pools over the spoon, it's a nice deep purple color. So I think that's done. So we're just going to strain out these cabbage leaves, then we're going to let this water cool a little bit, and we can dye our eggs. Here on the back burner, we've got our beets. You can see that this water has a nice, rich red color to it. So that looks done as well. So we're just going to let these cool off. Back here is our turmeric. This one's a little hard to tell because the turmeric really kind of mixes with the water, but it looks pretty richly colored to me. So I'm going to say that that's done too. So we'll go ahead and turn off the heat. We'll let this cool down as well. Now over here are blueberries. I'm not as hopeful about this one. I'm thinking this may be a failed experiment because I have done this with blueberries in the past, but what I did before was I boiled them and mashed them, and then at that point the blueberries weren't really good for anything else. Basically everything they had been given to the dye, and I really want to use these blueberries for something else, so I did not want to do it this way this time. So this might be a failed experiment, but I am going to go ahead and put some eggs in this anyway, and we're going to see what happens. So you can see here, the water is definitely kind of purpley, but you can see on the spoon here, it's pretty pale colored. So I think actually what I might do is strain the blueberries out to reserve them. And then I think once the blueberries are out, I'm going to boil just the water to try to concentrate it a little bit. We'll see if that works. But if you're just trying this and you just really care about the dye more than the blueberries, this does work really well if you boil it and mash the blueberries. It potentially would have worked better too if I maybe used a little bit less water. So that's why I'm going to try to boil this water and probably reduce it by about half and see if that makes a difference. All right, so I'm just going to carefully strain these blueberries out of here and set the blueberries aside, and then we'll try concentrating the water. Now you can see this water, this blueberry water really is a beautiful color, and so I'm hopeful that if we concentrate it a little bit, we might be able to get some really pretty eggs out of this. So let's boil this a little bit and give it a try and see what happens. While that blueberry water boils a little bit, I'm going to strain out our other dye. I'm going to take it off the stove so it can cool off, and then I will meet you back here to take a look at our blueberry water. Once our dye is cool enough, we can pop our eggs in there, and then we'll see how they come out. All right, so I've got all our dyes set up in these mason jars here. They're all cooled down enough that we can get our eggs starting to dye in them. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some vinegar to each of these jars, except in this tray here. You can see I've set everything up in these trays just in case there's any splashing or anything. I want to protect my surfaces. Now, these two jars here are both the cabbage dye. So as I said, we're going to do an experiment. We're going to add vinegar to one of these and not the other. Now over here, I have 2 jars with turmeric. I'm going to start, I think, a couple more of my eggs with yellow because I'm going to keep some of them yellow, but then some of the yellow eggs are going to be added to the blue dye or the red dye just to get an interesting combination of colors. Now this is what our blueberry dye ended up looking like. I don't know if that's rich enough to really dye an egg, but we are going to find out. And here we have our beets. So let's go ahead and add some vinegar to these jars and then get some eggs started. Now here are our 2 cabbage dyes here. So I'm going to add about a tablespoon of vinegar to one of them, and you can see the color change. Maybe, I'm not sure how well it showed up on the camera here, but I can see that it is noticeably lighter, and while this one is a nice dark blue, this one turned to a deep purple. So we're going to try some eggs in both of these, and we're going to see if the vinegar really makes a difference in the color, and also if it makes a difference in how well the dye saturates the eggs. So I'm going to add about a tablespoon of vinegar to this jar here. All the other ones, because they have slightly less liquid, will get a little bit less vinegar. We're just going to go ahead and I probably put about 2 eggs in each of these jars. We're going to let them sit for a little bit, really soak up that dye. So I'm going to make sure with this blueberry dye here that's a little bit lighter, I'm going to make sure that I put one of my lighter eggs in that dye. I think if I had white eggs, I might see a little bit more of a noticeable difference, but I'm going to use one of the lightest eggs I have to see if we can really see it make a difference. So we're just going to carefully drop that in there. And then we're just going to put, this may overflow a little bit. This is why I have it in the tray. Oh, or it might overflow a lot. So we're going to in. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get 2 eggs in this smaller jar. We're going to try it and see if a second one will fit. Yep. And we're definitely making a mess here. This tray was a good idea. Now I'm going to put another light one into this blueberry jar. This one has, as you can see, a hairline crack on it. I don't know if you can see that or not actually on the camera, but it did crack slightly while I was cooking them. So we're going to see... it should still be completely safe to eat. Once it's done dyeing, we're going to pop these in the fridge. And we're going to go ahead and put 2 eggs in each of these jars as well. This one also has a little bit of a crack, but I think it'll be okay. So as you can see, you may not want to fill your jars up quite as full as I did. But because I have them in my glass baking dishes, I think they're going to be okay. So we're just going to let these sit. One thing about dyeing eggs naturally is that the dye, because it's a lot less strong and less concentrated, it does take quite a bit longer to really penetrate the shell of the egg. So we are going to let these sit. I'm going to check on them again in maybe a half hour to an hour. And when I do check on them again, I'll make sure to show you how they're doing. So our Easter eggs are definitely not done yet, but I wanted to give you guys a little update about how they're doing so far. So honestly, I haven't been keeping super careful track of time, but I think they've been in the dye for about an hour. So I'm just going to pull a couple of them out, show you what they look like, and we are going to keep them in the dye quite a bit longer. I may end up keeping some of them in the dye overnight for a really dark saturated color. So first of all, these are our 2 cabbage dyes. This is the one without vinegar, and this lighter one has vinegar. So I'm just going to show you. You can see that this is a brown egg, but it's starting to get a really nice blue tint to it. It's still fairly light, and I would like it to be a little bit darker. Now this one, you can see, I think this one does have a little bit more of a purple tint to it. It's hard to compare exactly because these eggs were not exactly the same color when they went in. Now you can see there's little streaks where the dye isn't adhering quite as well. But I will say, I think the one with the vinegar is a little bit darker. So maybe the vinegar really does help with that. Let's pull over these eggs here and take a look at these. Now, the ones in the blueberry juice, I think that experiment may not have been all that successful. It looks like there's a little bit of tint to the egg, but not a lot. So I'm going to leave those eggs in there a little bit longer before I say that it was definitely a failure. But as of right now, I'm probably going to say if you want to use blueberries and get that deep, rich blueberry color, you're probably going to have to sacrifice the blueberries and really cook them and mash them to really get that color. As I said, I have done that in the past and it works well. I just wanted to use these blueberries for something else. So let's take a look at our beets and turmeric. Now, beets are always a great choice when it comes to dyeing, and you can see the beautiful, rich color of that egg. Especially, this egg has speckles on it, and you can see the speckles are really picking up the dark color of the beets, and that looks really pretty. I'm going to leave it in there a little longer, but I'm really happy with how that looks so far. Now, turmeric definitely leaves a little more of a subtle color when you're using brown eggs. If you're using white eggs, it does make them a nice bright yellow. But this is definitely warming up the color of the eggs. And I'm thinking what I'll do is probably these eggs in the front here, I'm actually going to turn them green. These I'll leave in here to get a nice darker yellow, probably a little bit more of a richer orange shade since it's a brown egg. And once these have soaked in here a little bit longer, I'm probably going to add them into the cabbage mixture to make a green egg. Now, it's not quite as important to me to get green eggs from my dye as it used to be because I do have 2 chickens that lay eggs that are naturally green without any dye. So these are really pretty. But I think that there'll be some nice variety if I make a deep, richer green. So I'm still going to give that a try. All right, so I have decided to pull some of our eggs out. So we have a few eggs that are done. So I've decided it's really a judgment call whether or not to use vinegar in the blue cabbage. These 2 eggs here were in the water that had vinegar, and these 2 eggs were in the water that did not have vinegar. Now, I think the variation that you're seeing between colors is mostly because of the natural brown of the eggs as opposed to the cabbage water. But as you can see, they both came out with lots of coloration. There isn't really a noticeable difference. These 2 eggs here were in the beets. Again, I think that the color variation is because this was initially a darker egg to start with. Now I think what I'm going to do here, I think I'm going to pull these eggs out of the blueberry water. You can see, I can actually get this out. This was the one that had the crack. Remember, it's actually a little more noticeable now that it's been dyed. It did make some difference in the color of the egg, but I don't think it's exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm actually going to take these eggs, or at least I'm going to take this 1 egg, and I'm going to put it into the water with the beets. And let's take a look at this one here. Yeah, same thing. I think I'm going to put this one in the cabbage water. We'll try the one without vinegar. Now, as far as the eggs and turmeric, these 2 back here I'm going to let sit in there a little bit longer. As you can see, they are developing a nice golden color, but I want them to get a little bit darker. These 2 here, I was actually not going for a golden color. I kind of want them to be green. So what I'm going to do is take these 2 eggs out, and I'm now going to switch them into the cabbage water to hopefully get a nice green color from them. We'll see what happens there. And you know what? What I think I'm going to do actually, I'm going to take this other egg out of the turmeric here, and I'm going to add this one into the water with the beets so that we hopefully get a nice coral color. I'm going to take 2 of these eggs that were in the cabbage, and I'm going to add them to this turmeric water just for a short time to try to get sort of a turquoise color. So we'll see what happens with that. I'll take these 2. So we're kind of into the experimenting with color part of the egg dyeing. So I'll bring you back here and we'll take a look at how these eggs are doing in a little bit. So we're done with these eggs, and I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave 1 egg in each of these jars of dye. We're going to just put a cap on them and stick them in the fridge overnight, and then tomorrow we'll pull them out and we'll see how rich of a color we can get by letting them sit in the dye all night. So I'm just going to get all these eggs packed up in the fridge. I'm going to meet you back here tomorrow and we'll take a look at our finished eggs. So I've gone ahead and taken our finished Easter eggs out of the fridge. I ended up letting 4 eggs stay in their dye in the fridge overnight, and so those are a really nice rich color. Let me show you what they look like. So these 2 here you can see I let sit in the cabbage dye overnight. There's some slight color variation because they were slightly different colors to begin with. This darker gold egg here, that was in the turmeric overnight. And this egg that came out like a dark brown color was sitting in the beet solution overnight. The one thing about natural dyes is that you will end up with some natural variation. So from one time to the next, your eggs may come out completely differently. In the past, when I have dyed brown eggs in a dark beet solution, what I've ended up with was a really dark brick red color, really pretty. And what we got this time was a little bit more of a dark brown with a reddish tint to it. So it's just really interesting to see the variation in the colors from each batch. I guess each batch of beets has some slightly different pigment in it. So it was really interesting to see how that came out. So I definitely encourage you guys to play around with your dyes. It can definitely be a lot of fun. I think my favorite eggs this time are the eggs that I dyed in the cabbage water. They came out a rich jewel tone blue, and those are really beautiful. Now, as I said, you're going to get completely different results if you use white eggs. I'm going to pop a picture up on the screen here of eggs that I have dyed in the past. I think I dyed these eggs a couple years ago where I used a mix of white eggs and brown eggs. So you can see that I got very different results that year. So depending on the color of eggs you're starting with, depending on the natural variation in the dye products that you're using, you're going to have completely different results. So if you do try this, I would love to hear how your eggs come out. And if you use any other foods for dye besides what I showed in this video, I would love to hear what your favorites are and how different types of foods did for you. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I know we are going to really enjoy these Easter eggs. They're not going to taste really any different than regular hard-boiled eggs, but something about having that fun shell color just makes them a little festive, a little more exciting. So we're definitely going to enjoy them. So I hope you guys are having a great day. I hope you have a wonderful Easter, and I can't wait to see you guys again soon. Bye guys, I'll see you next time.